Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute for people to join from the waiting room and we can get started. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of things before we get started with the webinar. So welcome again. Today's webinar is the RAD program, Securing Long-Term Rental Subsidy for Public Housing. The webinar is going to run for about an hour with time for Q&A. Before we start, I want to quickly tell you about the Housing Alliance. We are a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. Webinars are free for our members, so if you want to become a member, visit housingalliancepa.org/become a member, or you can contact us at info@housingalliance for more information. Move on to my next slide. So if you have a question, like a logistics question for the Housing Alliance staff, you can put that in the chat box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for the presenters, you should use the Q&A function, the Q&A box that is also at the bottom of your screen. So once again, any questions that you have for the presenters, you can leave them in the Q&A box. Lastly, a few Housing Alliance events that are coming up. We have the Rural Pennsylvania Housing Summit on July 23rd from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the Nittany Lion Inn in State College. Registration opens on May 19th. If you subscribe to our newsletters, we will usually send out a newsletter announcing that registration is open. We also have a few upcoming webinars. We do 1 or 2 every month. The next one is the update on the home energy rebate programs with the DEP. So if you're interested in hearing more about the HER and the HERE programs and what's going on with that, join us on May 6th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. You can find links to that on our events page on the Housing Alliance website. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Justin, Sabrina, and Jen. Thank you to our presenters for being with us today and also for sharing such great information with everyone.
Hello, I'm Jenn Krieher, and I'll be presenting first. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
I can see it.
Okay, great. So as I said, my name is Jenn Krieher. I'm a repositioning manager at Baker Tilly, and I've been at Baker Tilly for 4 years now. And prior to that, I was a repositioning consultant at another firm. I spent 10 years at HUD, 5 of them as a RAD transaction manager. This presentation will cover an overview of the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program known as RAD and the advantages of RAD and the other programs that fall under its umbrella. RAD is a voluntary preservation program that began in 2012. And we'll discuss throughout the presentation that RAD converts a project subsidy from the Section 9 public housing platform to the Section 8 platform. It has advantages for small, medium, and large PHAs. Across the country since 2012, almost 1,800 projects have converted to RAD while covering approximately 244,000 units. About 182,000 units have converted to RAD Section 8, 38,000 to non-RAD Section 8, almost 19,000 to LIHTC, and 5,500 to market rate units. While there is a small de minimis reduction allowance, RAD requires a 1-for-1 replacement of units. This means an existing 100-unit project undergoing 0, moderate, or substantial rehab will need a new RAD Section 8 Housing Assistance Payment or HAP contract for 100 units. If the project is new construction, at least 100 units will need to be covered under that HAP contract. There has been a total of over $23 billion in construction investment, including reserves, in closed RAD transactions since 2012. That equates to $94,000 per unit built or rehabbed. This pie chart represents the per unit rehab totals since the program began. There has been 13% construction investment in new construction projects. At a much higher level, there has been almost 38% investment in projects with 25,000 or less per unit. Projects with 25,000 to 75,000 per unit in rehab have had a construction investment of 17%, whereas projects with over 75,000 in rehab per unit have shown a construction investment of approximately 32%. RAD is advantageous for PHAs because it allows a conversion from Section 9 public housing to Section 8 without the need for a specific justification like the Section 18 program requires. Any PHA with public housing units can enter the RAD program. A PHA might want to consider RAD because public housing funding is unstable. The level of funds vary each year, and sometimes the funding does not come through on time. The red line in this graphic represents public housing funding of operating and capital program funds. Overall, public housing funding has decreased, whereas Section 8 funding in yellow has increased. Section 8 is considered to be a more stable funding platform. In addition, Section 8 is more attractive to lenders and investors. Lastly, Section 8 is generally considered a more simple program to administer without the public housing requirements of FAS, 5-year plans, and the need to operate both operating and capital fund grants. It's important to note that when a PHA changes its subsidy platform, it is not changing its mission. At RAD closing, the property is released from the annual contributions contract and declaration of trust. There is a housing assistance payment and RAD use agreement, and we'll discuss those more in the next slide. RAD allows PHAs to leverage debt and equity to pay for needed repairs and incorporate additional rehab components on their wish list to further improve the property. RAD requires a 15 or 20-year housing assistance payment or HAP contract, depending on whether the PHA chooses to convert to project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance. And I'll discuss that in more detail later. The HAP contract must be renewed in perpetuity to ensure affordability. There is a 20-year RAD use agreement, which is automatically renewed at its expiration for an additional 20 years. This shows HUD's long-term interest in the project. RAD offers creative ways to implement housing strategies. A PHA can convert one project, multiple projects, or its entire portfolio to RAD. The program gives the ability for modernization and rehabilitation of properties that are deteriorated due to deferred maintenance, and that's often because of lack of public housing funding over the years. A capital needs assessment is conducted to evaluate current and future capital needs spanning a 20-year term. You can see the other housing strategies offered, including demolition and new construction, transfer of assistance to a new site, which usually entails new construction, and mixed income developments that incorporate tax credit and/or market rate units. By modernizing, rehabilitating, or rebuilding properties, the PHA is improving units, common areas, and usually the landscaping of the property. All of these factors improve the quality of life for residents. Property revenue is stabilized because throughout the conversion, the PHA is looking at their budget, including operating expenses, and where expenses can be reduced if possible. Unlike any other HUD program, public housing operating and capital funds can be used in the capital stack for the RAD conversion. The funds are included as a source and likewise as a use in the form of other reserves. As mentioned earlier, RAD can be advantageous for PHAs of all sizes and geographies, and the percentage of conversions by size and locations are balanced. The RAD program prides itself on offering robust resident rights. There are required resident meetings throughout the conversion, including documentation of resident questions and the PHA's answers. There is a right to return to the new project without rescreening. Choice Mobility allows residents to request a tenant-based voucher after residing in the converted property for either 1 or 2 years, depending on whether it was a RAD project-based voucher or RAD project-based rental assistance conversion. We discussed the HAP contract earlier. Under the RAD PBV conversion type, a PHA can choose a 15 or 20-year term of the HAP. The rent caps for RAD PBV are the lower of HUD-determined RAD rents based on operating and capital funding levels, reasonable rents, or 110% of fair market rent. Both the Section 8 contract and funding are administered by the PHA, and some oversight is provided by the HUD Office of Public Housing. The conversion type of project-based rental assistance requires a HAP term of 20 years. Rent caps for PBRA are the lesser of HUD-determined RAD rents or 120% of fair market rents. Here, the Section 8 contract and funding are administered by HUD's Office of Multifamily. This shows the RAD process. I'll walk through it because there's a lot of information in this small plan. The Housing Authority begins with strategic planning, what it would like to do with this conversion. If 9% tax credits are contemplated, it's recommended that they apply for those right away. Then is the step to submit a RAD application to HUD. This can take 30 to 60 days or less, depending on how quickly documents can be put together. At that point, it's important for the client to interview and potentially engage environmental and capital needs assessment contractors. If 4% tax credits are contemplated, this is a good time to apply for those and also be looking at gap financing. 60 days following the RAD application, the RAD commitment to enter into a housing assistance payment contract, or CHAP, is awarded. At that time, HUD fair housing submissions are required for any transactions that include new construction, unit reduction, unit reconfiguration, or transfer of assistance. If your transaction doesn't include any of those, a submission is not required. Work begins on the RAD financing plan. There are specific components required for a concept call with HUD. When those components are completed, the concept call with HUD is requested and conducted. HUD then invites the Housing Authority to submit a financing plan, which is submitted 30 to 60 days following the concept call. 60 to 70 days following submission of the financing plan, HUD approval of the financing plan comes through and HUD issues the RAD conversion commitment, or RCC. That enters the RAD closing process. At that time, a RAD closing coordinator from the Office of Recapitalization is assigned, as well as an attorney from HUD's Office of General Counsel. The RAD closing process generally takes 60 to 75 days. At closing, a Section 8 HAP contract is put into place and is effective the first month following closing. Rehab or construction begins, and RAD rents go into effect January 1st following the HAP effective date. This is a timeline that breaks down what I've just said in the previous slide. And I'll give you a second just to look through it. This is just an easier to read summary. Information on the Section 18 program is included here to give context for the upcoming explanations of the RAD Section 18 blend options. The Section 18 program allows a PHA to demolish or dispose of units if they meet specific justifications outlined in HUD Notice 2024-40. The PHA receives tenant protection vouchers, which can be project-based in many instances. To dispose of a unit or property means there is a sale or transfer. The benefit of Section 18 over RAD is that often, but not always, the Section 18 rents of 110% of fair market value are higher than RAD rents. Sometimes RAD rents are 110% of FMR, in which case RAD may be the better option. And it's important to note here that in a blend, the Section 18 units are project-based. In a minute, I will explain the two types of RAD Section 18 blends, the construction blend and the small PHA blend. In a RAD Section 18 blend, the Section 18 component is a disposition of units with a 20-year HAP contract and TPV assistance, which again becomes project-based. Section 18 units can now receive either PBV or PBRA. This is a new provision, as they used to only be able to receive PBV. HUD produces a single blended rent schedule for all units resulting from a RAD Section 18 blend. The rent schedule is calculated as the unit weighted average contract rent by bedroom of the RAD rents and the converting TPV assistance for the Section 18 units. The advantages of the blends are there is an opportunity for higher rental revenue for two reasons. Often Section 18 rents are higher excuse me. Are higher than RAD rents. And RAD rents in a blend can be increased by demolition, disposition, transition funding that the PHA would otherwise have been eligible to receive for the Section 18 units. The RAD rent caps of 110% of FMR for PBVs and 120% of FMRs for PBRAs still apply. Blend transactions offer more flexibility because they do not require that projects conform to the specific justifications required by HUD for a standard Section 18 transaction. All of the advantages of RAD discussed earlier apply to the blends. RAD resident rights apply to the Section 18 units. Blends will only have one RAD HAP contract. This makes for easier contract administration. Under the construction blend, the percentage of RAD versus Section 18 units the PHA is eligible for is based on the level of rehab or new construction, whether there is demolition and redevelopment or a transfer of assistance. When there is rehab or new construction, the analysis for percentage of RAD or Section 18 units is done at the project level. That analysis is based on the hard construction costs compared with HUD's published housing construction costs for the market. The HUD housing construction costs can be found online and are adjusted by HUD annually. HUD has a spreadsheet that completes this analysis for the PHA with a handful of data inputs. This chart breaks down the eligibility criteria for the RAD Section 18 construction blend and the associated percentage of RAD and Section 18 units. Moving on to the small PHA blend, in order to be eligible for that blend, a PHA must have 250 or fewer units in its portfolio. That can be all it has ever had, or the PHA can whittle down to 250 units. RAD will not entertain a waiver to go over 250 units. That is their line in the sand. 90% of the units are disposed under Section 18 and receive either PBV or PBA subsidy, and 10% of the units convert to RAD. These can also receive PBV or PBRA subsidy. It's important to note that the conversion types must be consistent across the RAD and Section 18 units, meaning both must be either PBV or PBRA. That applies to the construction blend as well. When a PHA chooses to convert to PBV, those contracts must be administered by a PHA that already operates at least 250 housing choice vouchers before those RAD units are added in. That applies whether the existing PHA is administering their own contract or they need to partner with another PHA for contract administration. There is an ability for the local HUD office to consider a smaller voucher administrator that has less than 250 units in its consolidated HCV. HUD will consider a number of factors to make that determination. This is a chart showing that PHAs with 250 units or less in their portfolio can choose the small PHA blend and convert 90% to Section 18 and 10% to RAD. Here's a slide of valuable resources, including a YouTube video on RAD, the RAD webpage, RAD notice as revised by Supplemental Notice 4B. The new Supplemental Notice 4C is published in January. The RAD resource desk with a number of resources. The Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice. And the Section 18 and Blend Notice. And now we'll move on to the next presenter.
All right, thank you, Jen. I'll put my slides up on the screen. Okay. So my portion of the presentation is going to cover ways to pair RAD with other sources of funding. RAD is a versatile tool that can support different levels of recapitalization depending on the capital needs of the public housing. So we can think about this in terms of levels. So level 1 would be RAD without any other subsidy. And a conversion like this could happen if the property was built within the past few years and doesn't need any rehab. Level 2 would be RAD with soft subsidy, which could be local funding, state funding, or AHP funds. This is possible when the property needs light to moderate rehab that can be accomplished without low-income housing tax credits. Then level 3 is RAD with 4% tax credits. This takes longer than a non-tax credit conversion, but is still a faster execution than 9% tax credits. And this is a good idea when the property needs moderate to substantial rehab, and 4% credits are particularly helpful for larger properties because they aren't subject to a cap like the 9% tax credit. Then level 4 is RAD with 9% tax credits, which you would pursue if the property needs substantial rehab and 4% credits aren't enough to fund the renovations. And then level 5 is Restore Rebuild, which is the program formerly known as Faircloth to RAD. And this is really a different category because it involves the creation of new affordable units. And our next presenter will discuss this program. following my presentation. So zeroing in on RAD with low-income housing tax credits, it's a common approach. 43% of RAD conversions have used low-income housing tax credits, according to a 2021 study. And as far as the ownership structure, the LIHTC program requires a for-profit owner, but under RAD, the Public Housing Authority or an approved nonprofit must retain a controlling interest in that owner entity. RAD also requires permanent affordability. So even though the LIHTC regulatory agreement will run for at least 30 years, or in the case of Pennsylvania, 40 years, there will be a RAD use agreement that will mandate that the units remain affordable in perpetuity. So if you're pursuing RAD with LIHTCs, it's important to make a plan for getting through both the HUD and the state HFA closing processes. So this is a timeline contemplating a RAD conversion with LIHTCs in Pennsylvania. And Jenn's slides already had a timeline, so I won't cover this in too much detail, but I'll make a few comments specific to Pennsylvania. It's a good idea to get the CHAP issued before submitting the LIHTC application because the Pennsylvania Housing and Finance Agency will want to be able to underwrite to the CHAP rents. And then after the tax credits are awarded, you'll proceed towards closing on two tracks. One is the HUD track involving the concept call, the financing plan, and the RAD conversion commitment. And the other track is with PHFA, and that's the architectural submission and the pre-commitment meeting. And it's important to note that PHFA doesn't engage its counsel until after pre-commitment approval, and they will need to draft any of the PHFA loan documents before the HUD legal submission can go in. So that adds some time onto the typical PHFA closing timeline. A few other points to make. CHAP rents can get OCAF increases during the pre-development stage, and on a tax credit transaction, pre-development can last multiple years. So getting those OCAF increases is important, but those rents will also still be constrained by fair market rents and rent reasonableness. If the State Housing Finance Agency is going to be completing the subsidy layering review, HUD wants it included in the RAD financing plan submission. And if HUD is completing the subsidy layering review, you would ask them to do so in your RAD financing plan. And finally, RAD does not permit permanent displacement. So there might be a scenario where there are existing tenants in the public housing who make above the LIHTC income limits. And in that case, those units would need to be designated as market rate units for tax credit purposes, even though they will still be covered by the HAP contract and the residents will be able to remain in place. So now I'll move on to a case study. This is South Center and Brookline Court Preservation, which is in McKean County, Pennsylvania, along the New York border. The Housing Authority owns 200 units of public housing in the town of Bradford, Pennsylvania. And this conversion was split into multiple phases to allow for the possibility of multiple 9% LIHTC awards. So the first phase is the 72 family units, and then there are 128 elderly units that will be renovated in a subsequent phase. And these are townhouse buildings. They were unfortunately built without gutters and downspouts originally, which has been causing water damage. And there's also no community space, and the accessible units are not up to code. So the RAD conversion has happened, and construction is now wrapping up. The scope here included new community and maintenance buildings, the renovation of the administrative building, new porches and porch roofs at all front doors, roof replacements, new gutters and downspouts. 4 accessible units were brought up to code, repairing the damaged floors and ceilings, and modernizing the MEP systems. So the lesson here is that for a substantial scope of work like this, RAD plus 9% tax credits gives you the benefit of both the higher RAD rents to support debt and also the greater LIHTC equity of the 9% credit. And then soft funds are often also needed in a 9% LIHTC transaction. And this project did get soft funding from PHFA and the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. If the housing authority is on this call, they would probably tell you that the RAD conversion is a long and difficult process, but at the end of the day, the renovations are getting done. There are capitalized reserves now in place, and the property will enjoy the stability of a HAP contract going forward. So my contact information, I'm Justin Marshall, Senior Project Manager at Diamond and Associates. We are consultants for developers of affordable housing. So please contact us if you have any needs. And I will turn it over to our next presenter.
Hey, thank you, Justin. Can you guys see my screen?
I can see the slide. It's not the slideshow yet. I might have to click on from beginning.
Good.
No, I think I'm seeing your notes.
Okay, give me 1 second.
I usually find that slide sharing is so easy when you're doing it any other day.
Okay. Can you tell that I don't use this often?
We can also, the screen that you were sharing at first also worked just fine if you want to go ahead with that. In the meantime, I just want to remind our attendees that you can leave a question for our presenters in the Q&A function. We'll be answering it live at the end of the presentations.
I'm gonna try this again. Okay, we'll just have to work through.
Yes, that looks perfectly fine.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending your Thursday with us. My name is Sabrina Mercado. I'm an attorney at Ahmad Zaffarese. We typically serve as counsel to the Public Housing Authority. So my presentation will focus on the authority's counsel's perspective. My ultimate goal is to detail some ways to prepare for the RAD conversion closing so that the process goes as smoothly as possible. As touched on by Justin and Jen, the very purpose of the RAD program is to preserve and improve low-income housing by giving housing authorities and owners the ability to tap into private and public debt, as well as equity to meet capital needs. There's several ways to get to RAD. The two I'm most familiar with are fair cloth to RAD and just traditional RAD conversions. I won't spend too much time on fair cloth to RAD. It does involve new construction, and sometimes rehab. This rehab option lends itself to the RAD preservation goal. Under fair cloth to RAD, at finance closing, you close as public housing under HUD's mixed finance program, but you have the pre-approval to convert to the long-term housing assistance contract after construction completion. And traditional RAD is really at the core of preserving and improving the low-income housing that's already out there in existence. So what the RAD conversion does is it takes a project from Section 9 operating subsidy to Section 8 vouchers. Section 9 Section 9 comes from the U.S. Housing Act, and it authorizes HUD to provide operating subsidy to housing authorities for housing projects, for public housing projects. Section 8 of the U.S. Housing Act authorizes voucher assistance payments for existing market rate rentals. This RAD conversion from Section 9 to Section 8 is specifically authorized under the Consolidated and Further Continuing Appropriations Act of 2012 as amended. HUD has produced notices with instructions on how to convert, which Jenn has helpfully included in her resources slides. When converting, the documents that govern the project, aka your playbook, change, although some of the aspects do remain the same. So instead of the mixed finance ACC amendment, the Reg Op, and the declaration of trust, you'll have your RAD use agreement. And the RAD use agreement is recorded against the property for HUD's benefit, just like the DOT was. With some exceptions, HUD requires that the RAD use agreement be recorded above all other documents on title. HUD wants its interests to come before everyone else's. Second, you'll have the HAP contract, part 1 and 2, which can be between the project owner and the housing authority. And it's similar to the Reg Op. It establishes the rent payments and outlines the conditions and rules for receiving this money. When does Authorities Council come into the picture? Typically, we come in once the RCC has been issued. The RCC states that the conversion must close within 90 days of issuance, unless HUD provides an extension. Council is specifically responsible for assembling the RAD package. The RAD package is fairly large. I'll discuss some of the documents needed and what you can gather in advance. Council also drafts the closing documents and serves as HUD's escrow agent. And what that means is that we have to ensure that the documents we said would be executed and or recorded are, and that the recorded documents are recorded in the order in which we said they would be. When we submit the RAD package to HUD, we like to submit it in substantially final form, so HUD can complete its review in one go. For various reasons, I have not seen a RAD conversion close in 90 days, but hopefully with this presentation, we can help mitigate some of the common delays. So before council gets involved, it's a good idea to understand the ownership and control requirements, as Justin had mentioned. Per the RAD notice, HUD requires a project owner to be owned or controlled by a public or nonprofit entity. The project owner can be a tax credit entity controlled by a for-profit entity, but only if HUD finds that the PHA or nonprofit has a preserved interest in the property. The RAD notice describes 7 approved ownership and control options, the 7th being a catch-all, which are other arrangements approved by HUD. I've included a common control structure on the right. This is option 4 under the RAD notice, and it's where the nonprofit owns 51% of the general partner's interest in the tax credit entity, limited partnership in this example. If there's no nonprofit entity involved in the ownership structure, or you just don't fall into one of the control and ownership options, HUD permits the housing authority and the owner to enter into a control agreement. Under the control agreement, the housing authority has certain rights like approving disposition of the property, approving leases, and administering the wait list, and also selecting the management agent. As you get close to receiving your RCC, your RAD conversion commitment, we suggest confirming your rents. The rents in the CHAP and your commitment to enter into the HAP contract will be the rents that go in your RCC, and also subsequently the rents that go in your HAP contract. If the rents have to be updated, you'll have to get the CHAP reissued, which can take some time. After the RCC is issued, but before closing, the project owner must send a notification to tenants and have a meeting about the conversion. HUD requests this notification that's sent out, so it really doesn't hurt to get this drafted early. As part of the RAD package, If there's no new debt coming into the project, HUD requires a title report. I've come to learn that title companies refer to this as a record owner and lien search. Will also require a title bring down, which is based on the record owner and lien search. And what it does is it lists what the recording order will be at RAD closing. You'll need a title pro forma only if there's new debt on the project. The purpose of the title pro forma and the title report is in part to show what is of record. This gives Authority Council an idea of what documents will need to be subordinated to the RAD use agreement. Remember, HUD wants its interest to be in front of everyone else's on title. I do suggest ordering title as soon as possible. Reviewing and cleaning up the title pro forma or the report can be a bit cumbersome. Some of the documents that we've had to subordinate to the RAD use agreement include ground leases, mortgages, indentures of restricted covenants, and even intercreditor agreements. We suggest giving those who will need to be subordinated to the RAD use agreement a heads up that this is coming. There are also several documents required for the RAD submission that already exists, so it may help to just start gathering these a bit early. You'll have to provide Authority Council with an organizational chart, your formation and governing documents, so your, for example, cert of organization, your operating agreement. You'll also need to provide ownership documents like a deed or a ground lease, as well as all existing loan documents, so notes and mortgages, and all title encumbrances. So if there's a development agreement on the property or an operations and management agreement, HUD wants to see it all. If you have tax credits on the project, they're going to also require the low-income housing tax credit reservation letter, and they'll request a survey. There are a few documents that will be drafted by the project owner and or their council. The resident conversion notice is one which we talked about previously. HUD also wants to see a draft resolution from the project owner that approves the RAD conversion. Like in the public housing realm, where there was a rider to the operating agreement or the LPA with public housing provisions, in the RAD conversion, there are certain RAD provisions that must be incorporated into the owner's governing documents. So you'll have to amend your operating agreement or your LPA to incorporate these provisions. And the RAD provisions essentially state that the RAD use agreement is controlling should any conflict arise. It reiterates that what the ownership and control requirements are, and it explains what the project owner can and cannot do. So it's a good idea to get the resolution and amendment to the governing documents drafted and circulated to relevant parties for comments and sign off. And so when you get to closing day, you'll essentially be nullifying the public housing documents. You're terminating the mixed finance ACC amendment, you're terminating the Reg Op, and you're releasing the DOT and any related subordination agreements to the DOT. And to effectuate the RAD conversion, you'll be recording the RAD use agreement and recording the agreement to subordinate to the RAD use agreement. You'll be executing the HAB contract, part 1 and 2, along with some other ancillary documents like certifying final sources and uses, and in the certifications and assurances, we list out the full RAD submission, and we're certifying that nothing has changed. Thank you all again. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sabrina. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to start just shooting them your way. The first question that we have is, can you discuss the shifts in public opinion of RAD and some of the initial skepticism from tenant advocates?
I can take that one. So this is a tough one to answer because depending on the resident groups, some don't have any comments about RAD, or they have standard questions about the rehab or the new construction or how relocation will take place. And some tenant groups are vehemently against the RAD conversion and the fact that ownership will change from the PHA to a new owner, especially if there's a tax credit component. And RAD has tried to work with those tenant groups to reiterate the resident rights. But there's been a lot of media coverage of the tenant groups that are advocating against RAD. And I think HUD is just trying to work in conjunction with them to address their concerns. And of course, the individual housing authorities are trying to work with them to address their concerns and hopefully get to a good place with them. Does the commenter have anything?
Yeah, there were no follow-ups to that.
Okay.
But thank you. Justin, did you, I saw you come
Yeah,
off.
I'll just add, I mean, RAD is sort of making the best of a situation where Congress has often cut funding for public housing. And as a result, pub public housing funding is viewed as unstable, and the Section 8 program is viewed as a more reliable source of funding. And so, yeah, from a sort of overall perspective, right, we're losing public housing and moving it to the Section 8 platform, even though the residents retain their rights and the housing has to remain affordable. There is that shift happening, and really the reason for the RAD program is that is the reality of funding at the federal level.
Thank you, Justin. We have another question. This is from Jake. Any suggestions for ways to shorten the time for conversion to RAD after construction is completed? Are there any things we can work on ahead of time to convert and get tenants in more quickly? This would be for a Faircloth to RAD 9% LIHTC project.
Sure, I can take that one. Hopefully my presentation covered some of that. For specifically Faircloth to RAD, the deals that I'm on, I've been trying to build in these required RAD provisions so project owners don't have to go back and amend their documents. And so it's a good idea to look for those, whether it's in the rider to the operating agreement or whichever relevant document. For the subordination agreements, these usually can take some time to corral people and get signatures and get them to review. I will say that the agreement to subordinate is a standard HUD form. It doesn't change very much. So if you want to look at it and get that in front of the relevant parties to have a look and a discussion, that's never a bad idea. And one of the main hurdles at RAD conversion when the RCC is issued is really getting the title report and working with the title company. Title has a way of things appearing on there that weren't there before and that you have to kind of get settled. I've seen things appear on there from so long ago that like the deed restriction was handwritten. And so you have to get that like typed up and over to HUD and see if it really applies. And so engaging title as soon as possible would be my suggestion.
Thanks, Sabrina. We can go to the next question. The question is, for a complete demo and reconstruction project that will include both PBW and RAD, is the normal demo DISPO application still required to be submitted to HUD?
I'll take that. It sounds like this person is asking about the blend, the construction blend, and whether the standard Section 18 demo dispo application would be required. So in a RAD Section 18 blend transaction, the standard Section 18 application is not required. And I'm sorry, I was remiss in mentioning this. This is a streamlined process wherein a RAD financing plan is submitted and note is made to the HUD transaction manager during the concept call that this is a blend, and the RAD financing plan is approved, and that incorporates some aspects of Section 18 required documents, such as a letter of support from the mayor, a spreadsheet designating which apartments will be RAD, which apartments will be Section 18, resident consultation, board resolution, and so forth. And the Special Application Center reviews those documents and does a streamlined approval. So a separate Section 18 demo dispo application is not required for either type of blend.
Thanks, Jen. We have one last question in the chat, which is, can you talk a bit more about what the resident engagement process looks like and the role that residents play?
I could speak to that. So there are 5 resident meetings that are required as part of the RAD conversion process. That was actually increased from 4 about a year and a half ago. So it's definitely a priority of HUD. There are 2 resident meetings required before submitting the RAD application, 2 more resident meetings required at the time of the concept call with HUD, and then a final resident meeting required before the issuance of the 30-day closing notice. And HUD has templates for notification of residents of these meetings. And so the Housing Authority has to provide evidence that residents were notified. They have to provide minutes from the resident meetings, and they have to demonstrate to HUD that questions from residents have been satisfactorily answered. So resident engagement is definitely a priority of HUD in this program.
I lied. This was not the only question that we have. We have one more. Do you anticipate any changes in RAD with the change in administration? Does anyone want to take that question?
I'll give it a shot. So certainly we've seen reduction in HUD staff as HUD staff have taken retirement or taken the option to leave via the fork in the road email, and that's been a loss in institutional knowledge. However, to my knowledge, there has not been anyone who has left the Office of Recapitalization, which administers the RAD program. And we are hearing through industry organizations that there is still push for conversions from public housing to Section 8, which fares well for the RAD program. Something that could certainly impact that is, again, what we're hearing from industry organizations, that there's talk among the administration about decreasing voucher funding. So that could impact the ability of housing authorities to convert to PVV or use these Section 18 blends in which the Section 18 units are getting TPV assistance, which is project-based. So there certainly are a lot of questions, but from speaking to HUD, we don't have the answers.
Thanks so much, Jen. There are no more questions, so we can start to wrap up. Thank you, Justin, Sabrina, and Jen, for sharing, your wealth of knowledge with us. This was great. Thank you to the attendees for your questions and for being with us today. We'll be sending out any materials that were shared today, including the presentation slides and the recording for this webinar within a week of this webinar. So keep an eye out for that. Reach out to us if you have any questions. If you want to be connected to the panelists, also reach out to us. But thank you all for being here with us today, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Justin,
you.
Sabrina, and Jen. Bye. Have a good
Bye.
afternoon. Bye.
And